Hi everybody, thank you for watching this video called The Futility of Indicators, How Core Component Functionality Enabling a Decade of Espionage. This investigation was based on the findings collected after analyzing almost 10 years of files of the APT known as Machete, and there are really good reports on this APT. Actually, there was an amazing job made last year in various bulletin, but this is not about Machete itself, but how we can protect ourselves better if we start focusing on the core components of an APT or a thread instead of just looking at its IOCs. In this talk, I'll cover the following topics. First, who am I? I'm going to introduce myself. Then I'm going to talk about details around the analysis of the malware pieces year by year and campaign evolution of Machete. Then the core components and tactics evolution, followed by who is behind Machete and targets, and last but not least, some conclusions and recommendations. So, who am I? I'm Gabriela. I have been a threat intel analyst for 5 years now in Argentina. This is my third investigation presented in various bulletins, so I'd like to thank the conference for still believing in me. And my focus is mostly doing malware analysis. This investigation started when I felt inspired by other analysts that investigated on Machete, but also pointed out that there are a lot of investigations and reports around threat actors with targets all around the world, but in general, we lack of visibility when it comes to Latin America. So what I did here is first select Machete because I wanted to understand everything I could around this APT, that is one of the most famous targeting Latin American targets, and I collected all I could find around this threat actor. News, files, reports, and classified all the files I could get per year, and then reverse all of them. And at first, the idea was to understand how it changed over time, what it did, but then I realized that with all the data I collected, I could actually focus on studying the behavior and extract the core components, meaning what makes Machete be Machete. If you remember the paradigm of pain, you know I'm referring to the TTPs. And above all, the TTPs that didn't change over time. You may remember that TTPs are the most painful thing for a threat actor to change. Domains, IPs, hashes, artifacts are easier, so it is important to know them. The Machete APT group was first observed in 2010 and has been active since then. It uses a modular info stealer that is also called Machete that, depending on the year, it added or removed some features that we will see in a couple of slides. In addition, the Machete info stealer uses software that can be found in open sources to carry out their activities in combination with their own developed code. The targets that I will show later are based on the files that I collected, meaning that there may be more targets mentioned by other security researchers based on their visibility, but I wanted to show my own findings instead of showing other people's amazing job. So, through the years, Machete had made some changes in the way the attacks were conducted, and we will see each of those changes, but in general, we can summarize the attacks into this attack chain. So first, the initial vector. They use exploit kits, emails with either an attachment or a URL. Some versions have the capability to spread via USB drives, and they also use web injects. But from all those vectors, the emails are the preferred method to distribute the malware. At this point, a potential victim is presented with either a 7-zip or an NC-Nullsoft SCR file, which is basically a self-extracting archive file. And thanks to social engineer techniques, once the victim executes this file, at the same time, it shows a decoy file that can be either an office document, a PDF, or an image to make the victim believe the right file was open, while in the background, a self-extract file that can be either a self-extracting RAR file or again an ANSYS nusoft SCR file starts to run. Sometimes decoy documents contain pieces of news that were made public the same day or a few days before the decoy was sent. This self-extract file contains Machete main features and is composed by both legitimate files and malicious files written in Python to carry out their activities and achieve their goal, that is, collecting victims' data. This data is obfuscated or encrypted to make it easier to exfiltrate as it is smaller in size. And finally, the data is exfiltrated. Now I'm going to talk about the details year by year. Starting in 2010, Machete was the name that other security researchers used to refer to a Java-related application that downloaded a file and executed it. But unfortunately, the payload was not published. It is important to note that at this point, Machete had a cross-platform capability that, depending on the operating system, it will take a different action, and this capability was not observed in later versions. In 2011, they used self-extract RAR files, which were programmed to show the decoy file and at the same time run the malicious file that used Java-related files and icons. And it's interesting to note that they used the Java-related file names because of the Java file found in 2010. The malicious files at this point were 6 Py2exe files that terminated processes, deleted uncreated folders and files, used an FTP server to exfiltrate data, and used the MAC address, the computer name, and the content of a TXT file to create a folder in the FTP server to be able to identify each victim and upload their data in that folder. And the data at that time was the IP config, the keyboard strokes, the clipboard information, some files with a specific file extension, screenshots, webcam snapshots, and audio recordings. In addition, they use simple obfuscation to hide the FTP server configuration details that could be easily deobfuscated using the obfuscation routine that you see in the slide. Once they obfuscated, you could see the FTP details that include the IP, the user, and the password. In some cases, they put 2 IPs using the second one as a fallback server. In 2012, they continued to use self-extract RAR files with Py2exe files inside. And they added USB and geolocation features and also included new processes names and started to use AES in CVC mode to encrypt files and encrypt their file names using ROT13. Also, instead of using IPs, they changed and began to use domains for the FTP servers. And they became more modular and now started to use 7 files to carry out their activities instead of 6. In 2013, they still use self-extract RAR files with Py2exe files. And they added scheduled tasks and organized the code inside the files in a more structured way. They also started to use a file called BER that contained a number to track the campaigns, but it was not a sequential number. They also went more modular and added an 8 file to carry out their activities. In 2014, they used both self-extract RAR files and SCR files that were actually ANSYS installers with Py2exe files inside. And they changed file names and icons, but still using Java-related file names. And they removed the FTP information from the Python files and put it in a file disguised as a DLL. And they also started to use another file to enable or disable features such as the camera feature. They also started to use obfuscated names for the folders within the FTP server, and they removed the geolocation feature and compress their feature set in just 7 files again. In 2015, they started to use a new set of Python files with Realtek related file names and icons, along with the Java ones that we observed before. So there were 2 campaigns, and both campaigns were added an obfuscation layer in the Python files using a known obfuscator known as iObfuscate, which made them difficult to read. In 2016, they added a new layer of files instead of just having one archive file to deliver the decoy file and the Python files. They added an archive file that had zip or rar extension, and that file delivered the other archive file that contained the decoy file and the Python files. Apart from that, they used the same files they used in 2015, but only changed the content of the configuration files. For example, the version and the FTP configuration details. In 2017, they used mostly 2 campaigns. One was similar to the 2015 Realtek campaign, and the other was new and used Chrome-related names and icons with SCR extension, but still these were Py2exe files. They also removed the audio capture feature and didn't add it again in later years. And one campaign that caught my attention and was pointed out by other security researchers as well was a Java-related campaign that had a certificate, and within one of the Python files, it had a routine to exfilter their files to a Dropbox account, as it can be observed in the slide. In 2018, the code changed significantly. They used self-extracting 7-zip files that contain decoy documents and rar files. These were not LZIP files as seen before, but regular 7-zip and rar files. The rar file contained Chrome-related file names, but compressed all the features within only 3 files. One was the launcher of the spy component, other was the spy component that contains most of the feature sets, and the other was the exfiltration component. And these campaigns used 2 files for the configuration that were disguised as DLL files. They still use Py2exe files, but added a new layer of obfuscation using a known obfuscator called PyMinifier that basically added base64 encoded text. So we had this new layer of obfuscation above the other layer of obfuscation before we could see the real feature set of Machete's files. And they also restored the geolocation feature and added 2 features to obtain data of web browsers. One for credentials and the other for bookmark discovery. At last, in 2019, they changed again the code significantly and replaced the Py2exe files with 6 Python script files. These files were found inside an archive file called python27.exe that also contained all the legitimate libraries it needed to run properly. And this file was decompressed in a folder called c-python.7. This campaign uses only one configuration file that contains several strings encoded in base64. And you can see the decoded version of them in the slide. This was an overview of all the features and changes Machete did over time. Now, some details about their infrastructure. If we take all the IPs and domains collected from the malware pieces since Machete appeared, we can map their infrastructure in a graph to see if we can find a relationship between them. At the beginning, they used IPs and fallback IPs, and then we observed the change to domains. So all this information together allowed us to see all available historic DNS host resolutions, and we were able to see that they reuse infrastructure over time. In total, I collected only 10 static IPs or domain-based FTP hosts associated to the samples in all the time. For example, the IP address marked with an arrow in the slide was linked to at least 4 different domains between September 2016 and September 2017. And the reason why they use this IP for an extended amount of time is due to the use of dynamic DNS providers in short periods of time. So these domains also reflect the Machete preference of dynamic DNS services. Prior to August 2019, all the Machete domains that I observed were registered using an OIP service, which gave them 2 advantages. One, it provided additional operational security by masking the registrant. 2, it allowed the dynamic DNS domains to essentially fast flux between a series of IP addresses, allowing a single IP to be constantly reused among several different domains and potentially different targets and campaigns over a period of many months for a short duration. However, while they reuse IP addresses, they didn't rely on a single hosting provider, which allowed them to increase operational security. In this slide, we can see all available historic domains resolution for these IP addresses from multiple datasets according to ASN and ordered chronologically, and we can see their preference for hosting providers change over time. We can see that there are occasionally overlaps in time periods. They rarely reflect the use of more than 2 hosting providers simultaneously. Initially, Machete operators used a Latin American hosting provider and gradually shifted to more reliable and inherently trusted global service providers such as Amazon. At some point, Machete operators, likely concerned that such ISPs could operate with investigators to reveal their cyber espionage objectives, they moved to SDN networks with notoriously robust privacy policies such as Hetzner, OVH, LeaseWeb, and more recently Cloudflare, as we can see in the slide. So based on all the features observed during the malware analysis of the files collected for almost 10 years, and using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to map their TTPs per year, we get this huge table as a result. It is important to note that one feature could not be mapped, that is the geolocation feature, which it is not in the framework. It is only available for Android and iOS and not for Windows. And it's also important to know that this mapping was made before the recent changes in which they added sub-techniques, so they were not considered in this table. Having that said, we can observe the threat actor put a lot of effort through time and played with the techniques, adding obfuscation or removing features or changing the code in an effort to keep operating and remaining undetected by security controls. And from all techniques, if we order them by how often they were used from year to year, we can get as a result Machete's core components that are the ones repeated in all the years and were marked in orange color. It is important to note also that as the 2010 payload could not be retrieved, I couldn't confirm the feature set, so I put a question mark in the table. In all of several campaigns, they use the PyHook library, they use modular malware to infect, persist, collect, and exfiltrate sensitive data from organizations and networks predominantly in Latin America. And as it can be observed, there is a consistent behavior during extraction, execution, file and directory creation, data capture, including hooking, encryption, encoding, and exfiltration over this approximately 10-year period. We can also order this huge table by tactic to have a better understanding on how they act step by step. First, the initial access that, as we know, they use several techniques, and as I mentioned before, the favorite one were the spear phishing attachments and links. Then from 2011 till 2017, they implemented the removable media feature, suggesting that they may have had physical access to targets during this time frame and they no longer possess. Regarding execution, they showed consistency over time. Upon user interaction, a self-extract archive file uses encrypted functions, often depending on legitimate Python libraries. They have used multiple forms of persistent mechanisms, even occasionally several different types within the same malware pieces. For example, initially the actors relied on the use of shortcuts, which were placed in the starter folder, and in 2013 they began using scheduled tasks for execution of some of the Machete modules. By January 2019, they only use scheduled tasks for persistence, which represents advantages for the attackers, as it is more reliable and stable than initiating the malware at startup, as it can occur at the threat actor's discretion. But, however, it requires escalated privilege in comparison to using startup-based persistence. Machete also accomplished persistent and privileged escalation using the PyHook library and hooking techniques across all known instances. The diffusion evasion techniques have been persistent across the entire sample set, and it's important to note the lack of changes in these techniques over time, which is understood by examining the low detection rates for the malware pieces. And for these reasons, they are not required to make significant changes to evade detection, as the malware is inherently difficult for security controls to detect, which make them highly effective. The credential access techniques are closely aligned with the Machete data discovery and collection methods. When examining the malware comprehensively, we can see that Machete operators initially relied on the input capture exclusively to harvest credentials. Then in 2014, they began to use files disguised as DLL to put the FTP credential information, and they didn't incorporate web browser-based credential theft until 2019. The majority of discovery techniques pertain to system configuration and programs and processes from 2011 to 2019. However, as I mentioned before, the ability to map peripheral devices was introduced in 2012 and then removed in 2018 in an effort to reduce detection. Also, in 2010, the malware contained functions which identify specific operating system, but that feature was not observed in later years. Regarding lateral movement techniques, we observed the remote file copy capabilities, which was changed by MITRE to ingress tool transfer and was maintained in all analyzed samples, which allow them to move data. Last, between 2010 and 2019, the Machete malware had demonstrated broad data collection capabilities, which have, at various times, included nearly all techniques typically associated with cyber espionage tools, which are input from the keyboard, keyboard strokes, and collecting data from a variety of locations. However, in comparison to many malware which adds data collection functionality over time, Machete operators decided instead to remove certain capabilities. Now, who is behind Machete? I don't like to talk about attribution, but based on the information collected from the analyzed files, I can mention the following. In one hand, the threat actors speak Spanish based on the code and the decoy documents. There were found a lot of strings in Spanish language, and they added some strings in English, but at the very beginning, they used a lot of Spanish. Then the configuration files observed in the campaigns mention places that were used to create the URLs, and those places belong to Latin American locations. Then, some samples had the string arcantons used in both the URL path and an FTP password, and this could be a word that references a video game if you Google it, but it also references the name of a Latin American band led by a singer called Juan Fernando Sanchez, and also is the name of a bar in a Latin American country. I also saw the string Juan Carlos Sua that was used as a USB file path found in 2013 and may reference a Latin American artist called Juan Carlos Suarez. In addition, before using DNS service provider, in 2011, we could observe a couple of IPs that belong to a Latin American hosting provider. And finally, the target institutions included diplomatic, governmental, and military entities, and some of the decoy documents mentioned dissident Latin American groups and Latin American countries. So, during the investigation, not all the Machete files contained decoy documents, but from those that had decoy documents, I could extract 56 of them, and I focused on the ones that, based on the content and the submission country, I could put in a map. So, there were 14 documents referencing Venezuela. 8 were too generic to associate with any target. 6 reference Nicaragua, 6 reference Ecuador, and 6 reference Colombia. 4 reference Spain, 3 reference Mexico, 3 reference Chile, and other 3 reference Brazil, which was really interesting because Brazil speaks in Portuguese, not in Spanish. And finally, 1 document reference Bolivia, 1 document reference Cuba, and another document reference Peru. These are some of the decoy documents that were observed, but because of the nature of the content, it was better to have them blurred. These documents use Spanish names for the file names and were also written in Spanish language. Here we see 3 documents related to the center of separatist groups, one from Colombia and another one from Nicaragua. Then we have another set of decoy documents that are about politics and references elections equipment in Venezuela and explain how to use it. Then we have another document that imitates the correspondence of Cuban embassy, changing their address in Peru. And a third one contains a shield related to the Cuban embassy. The third set is about military documents that appear to be legitimate documents stolen from Venezuela. The first document was dated September 20, 2015, and is a good example on how fast Machete is, as this document was found in a Machete archive file less than 24 hours after it was first seen. We also see a document from November 2019 containing the official guidelines for the destruction of classified documents, and the last picture belongs to a document to enforce security. So, what can we take from this video? First, based on all the behavior and features and changes that I described, we can say that Machete APT has really good capabilities to achieve its goals and is able to adapt when needed, which also means that there are a lot of people that since 2010 are putting a lot of effort, resources, and money to keep this going. And there are many APTs that have been around for several years and keep succeeding. So we need to put more effort in understanding how they do what they do. Second, if we consider that this APT has been around for 10 years and we need to use something stronger than indicators because indicators change all the time. In a 10-year period, we collected hundreds of IPs, domains, file names, but the indicators approach shouldn't be the only one we use when we want to protect against APTs. That is why the MITRE ATT&CK framework appeared. Indicators are important for little periods of time. Most indicators are set a time to live and then discarded from security solutions. But if we focus on understanding the core components of a threat, meaning what makes a threat be a threat and how it acts, then we will able to have a better understanding and will be able to build better rules to defend ourselves against their attacks. Finally, I give you some recommendations on how you can defend your companies against these threat actors. First, you need to make sure that your security controls are able to detect the core capabilities that I mentioned in order to mitigate the risk of being attacked by Machete. Then, monitor your endpoints to include file and directory creation and process execution. Then you need to know your network to know what is normal and be able to detect anomalous behavior, focusing on the characteristics mentioned during this presentation. Also, make sure your email gateway controls are configured to detect self-extract archive executables. Make sure your network gateway controls monitor DNS traffic. And of course, try to keep your systems up to date, specifically public-facing web applications that can be a potential entrance to your networks. Thanks for watching this video, and again, thanks to Virus Bulletin for including me in the program. I look forward to your questions at bvlocalhost.com. Bye.